Thank you all so much for coming. It's always fun for me to be back home. As many of my friends know, I'm a split. I'm a Texan and I'm a Cape Cod girl, kind of all rolled into one. And one of my favorite subjects is the Hyannis Senior. Jim Graham is a friend, a man that I met a couple of years before his book came out. And I said to him at the time, I don't think I can help with anything that you're looking for at the moment, but when this book is published, please come and review it at the JFK Hyannis Museum. He said he would like to do that. And the day he arrived on the Cape with his wife, Linda, I said to him, you must come to Dallas. We have to call Dallas right now. And it seems as though that's how this all got pulled together. I am so pleased to be able to introduce this man to you. He has been in the communications and public relations business as a consultant for over 30 years in the state of Illinois. He's consulted with the House of Representatives there. He helped advise a former governor, which gave me pause. I haven't asked him which governor that was. He's consulted with many corporations and associations. Victura is his first book. It is now out in paperback. It was recently translated into German, and he just returned from Germany on a promotional trip over there. It was selected as Best Pick in 2014 by the Chicago Book Review, and it was selected to be part of a program called Chapter a Day on Wisconsin Public Radio. So I'd say that's pretty good for your first book. He has been on the Cape and has sailed more than once in a Hyannis Senior, and I am pleased to introduce him, Jim Graham.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy, and thanks for all the work you've done for two museums, for this one and for the one in Hyannis Port where you're on the board, and also active with the Hyannis Senior Association. So I just got back from Berlin with there's a Kennedy Museum in Berlin of all places, and I have to connect you with them too because they could use your support, I think. In the video, and thank you also, Lucy, for this video. It was a wonderful film, and there are more than a couple of people in that video that I would love to have been able to interview myself, one of whom is Ted Crosby, who's the guy who had been building wooden boats for decades, and he passed away recently, sadly. But I kept trying to get an interview with Ted, and at one point I said to him, Ted, I'll send you an email to just explain to you what the book is about. And he looks at me and goes, Email's the worst invention in the history of mankind. And I don't want to do. And it's like exactly what you would expect from a guy who's been building wooden boats and still did at that time. But this whole thing has been a wonderful experience, and Lucy's helped make it so. And I have actually a short story I'll add about a little sail that Lucy and I went on recently. Thanks also to the sixth floor museum for hosting this. I know when I first talked to, I believe it was to Nicola earlier on, I think it was her who said to me, obviously this is a museum that's built around the tragic events, obviously, of November 1963, but they're really interested in telling a bigger story. And one of those stories is the legacy of John F. Kennedy and of the Kennedy family. And one thing that I tried to do is talk a bit in this book about the family legacy, a story that I think has not really been told so much. That is the legacy of Kennedy's passing one thing on to the other, and which still benefits us today, as well as the family itself. So I'll get right to it. And I have several pictures I'd like to show you as I go through, because I really think, I was just talking to Red Dog earlier about sailing, and I said to him, one of the things I love most about sailing is just being out there looking at other boats. And I think if you're going to talk about the Victoria, you have to see it. And see the lives of the Kennedys around this boat. It's a small boat. It's only about 25 feet in length, as was explained, sits in front of the JFK Library and Museum in Boston. And this is not a yacht. This is a small boat. You sail it, you get wet, it heels over to the extreme. And so that's what I think made it a unique thing for the family, in the way that the experience drew them so close together. But why did I think that there would be such a big story in such a small boat? Well, the idea for it, and I'd seen this boat at the museum many, many years before, but the idea for this particular story told in the book came in 2009 when Ted Kennedy died. And there were two services, one at the JFK Museum and another at a church in Boston. And scores of people were called up to give eulogies. President Obama, Caroline Kennedy, other members of the family, members of the U.S. Senate. And what struck me is that I discovered that 4 different people who got up and talked about Ted Kennedy told stories about sailing with him on the Victura. And here's a U.S. senator who'd been in the Senate for 47 years, and 4 different people at his funeral decided that the way to really get at the essence of the man is to describe their experiences with him on the Victura. And so I looked into it, and I did find there's much, much more to that boat and its relationship to the family over now about four generations of Kennedys. And that's why, and I also, these are eulogies about Ted, but the boat itself has always been associated with John F. Kennedy. So that told me that this was going to be a story about the relationship with the siblings. So it's as we all know, the story of the Kennedys is really epic in scope. Through World War II and all the other the White House years, and I'm not going to attempt to cover all of those periods of time, but I did want to try to focus on 2 areas. One of which is how the Victura contributed to the building of the Kennedy brand, that image that we have of the Kennedys. And then the second part I want to address more briefly is the contribution it had to building them as a family. The use of, or the role that the Victura played in building this Kennedy brand really started as early as 1934, when this picture was taken, and the Boston Globe came out to Hyannis Port. Why? Because Joe Kennedy had just been appointed chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was right in the aftermath of the stock market crash, a very big job. And so the Boston Globe came out to do a portrait of the family and published this photo of Jack when he was about 17. He looks more like 14 in this photo, but he's actually about 17. And his brother Bobby, who I think was about 7 or 8 when that photo was taken, on the Victura. You go forward about 6 years to 1940. Now Joe Kennedy has become U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. And this time, Life magazine sends a photographer out to Hyannis Port to take photos of the family, again on the sailboat Victura. I always like to ask if people in the audience can identify which of the folks in this picture is Ted Kennedy. That one's easy to pick out, but that's Joe Jr. in the back steering the boat, and Bobby to the right. And the sisters, I won't try to identify them all. I don't think it's Eunice, Patricia, Kathleen, and then Rose Kennedy next to Joe. The interesting thing about this photo is that it was taken by a photographer who became much better known later for a photograph he took on VJ Day in Times Square, Alfred Eisenstadt. Of course, during the war, John F. Kennedy went off to the war, as did his brother Joe, and he became skipper of this PT-109, and this image that had already begun to be shaped of the Kennedys as sailors and outdoors people. Now this legend of JFK as war hero, naval war hero, is beginning to be crafted. And with this incident of PT-109, Joe, who had some experience with publicity because he had spent some time as a Hollywood movie producer, used this story to help bolster John F. Kennedy's campaign for when he first ran for the U.S. House. And then the story of PT 109 was something that was told and retold all throughout JFK's political career. And Michael Beschloss, the historian, recently remarked that maybe all those images of JFK sailing were a subtle way of reminding people of his war experiences. After the war, of course, John F. Kennedy did run for the House, and then in 1953, he was a newly elected member of the U.S. Senate, and Life magazine once again comes out to take a picture of JFK and his fiancée, the former Jacqueline Bouvier and future First Lady, again on the bow of the Victura. Lucy was pointing out earlier that you would never sit that way on a Hyannis Senior, but so they're obviously using it for promotional purposes. So after 53, all the way through the presidential campaign, they continued to go sailing with photographers. This was John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline, again, 1960, still campaigning for president. So this image is being used. And John F. Kennedy was not a particularly healthy guy. He had suffered from back problems throughout much of his life. He secretly had Addison's disease, denied that he had it, but in fact he did. Which just in the 40s, 50s, they were beginning to learn how to treat Addison, so his health dramatically improved. But getting this out there on this boat really helped craft this image of a guy with youthful vigor and stamina and strength. But the story, the experience that they had sailing the Victoria and this experience of bringing photographers out came to be a double-edged sword, because when John F. Kennedy was elected to the White House in 1962, I believe this photo was taken. So JFK is sailing as the president. Now, they used to love having a photographer or one or two come out and take pictures, especially in the campaign. Now they're getting boatloads of journalists coming out and photographing them all the time. This is about the time when the word paparazzi came into popular usage. On this particular day, right after this photo was taken, the boat ran aground, and John F. Kennedy and the crew had to get out and push the boat off the shoals, something that frequently happens in the shallow waters of Nantucket Sound. So John F. Kennedy the next morning got on Air Force One to go back to Washington, D.C., and he opened, and this is at a time when it's Air Force One, so you've got a press corps in the back of the plane. He's got an office. He opens the newspaper and sees this headline, and he was furious. He summoned his press secretary and showed him the article and said, "This is an outrage. You can't have the captain of the ship of state running the boat aground. We have to get this article retracted." And the president was furious, so he sent his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, to the back to try to convince this UPI reporter to retract the story. So the reporter reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photograph of the president and his crew waist deep in water pushing this boat, a photo that had not at that time yet been published. So Pierre Salinger walked away with his tail between his legs, and that was the end of that. No retraction. The one thing I wanted to mention that's kind of a funny thing, and this involves Lucy and I. I've been talking here about this whole effort to use sailing as a way to build an image. And just about a month ago, I had a call from a French television program. It's a program that's broadcast nationally in France. They say they have 4 or 5 million in their audience, and they wanted to come out and do a story about my book, The Victura, and about the Kennedys and their love of the sea, because they're going to do a larger story about Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. And they wanted to come out, and they wanted to see if they could get somebody to take us out on a Hyannis Senior, and they'd interview me as we sailed around. And I said, yeah, and I think I know somebody who might be able to help with that. And I call Lucy, and she immediately says, let's go out on Dixie, which is her boat. And so the French crew comes out, and a reporter and a camera person, and we go out and I'm walking up and down the beach in front of the Kennedy compound, and they're getting images of me looking like a thoughtful author, just for they call it B-roll in the industry. And then we went out sailing, and there I am with these images. They had a second boat, so there are images of this beautiful sailboat, Dixie, Hyannis Senior, just like the president's boat. And I'm sailing it, steering it, and the wind's going through my hair, and the music comes up, and there's the lyrics in English for some reason are, "Man of the ocean." You know, I'm looking really good. But what was never captured in the video, thank God, was the fact that every moment when there was anything difficult to do with the sailing of this boat, Lucy would take the helm. You know, we'd be in the harbor and go out this really narrow channel with the wind blowing directly in the channel, so she, you know, having to tack out through the channel. And you know, if the wind picked up, you know, she'd have to tell me everything, you know, what to do. And yet I'm the man of the ocean, you know. But it was, and so thank you, Lucy, for indulging me on that. You know, in terms of the contribution that sailing had to the image of the Kennedys, in addition to the pictures and the video that came out, there was also the poetry and the art of the sea that the Kennedys came to love as they, you know, as they got older and they loved the sea. And as the Kennedys went into the White House, they really turned the Oval Office itself into kind of a shrine to American seafaring. There were ship models all throughout the Oval Office. There were paintings of famous American battleships on the walls. The cannon, there were a pair of cannon bookends, cannon shaped. They were models of the cannons from the USS Constitution in Boston. The desk that President Kennedy used had been in the basement, but Jackie found it, and it had been built from timbers taken from the Resolute, a British Arctic exploring vessel that had timbers turned into a desk, and the Queen of England gave it to a previous president. So it was all about seafaring. And the president began to also introduce metaphors of the sea into his speeches. There was one poem in particular that he really loved, and I refer to it quite a bit in the book, Ulysses by Alfred Tennyson. Ulysses is based on the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey by Homer. The Romans called him Ulysses. And it's basically a story of a legendary seafaring leader. And their interest in that particular poem, which became used in speeches that many of the other Kennedys used later on, that all started with a 10-year-old girl, again, Jacqueline Bouvier, the future First Lady. She memorized Ulysses when she was 10 years old. It's 70 lines of poetry, I think something like 566 words, and not an easy feat for an adult to do. I haven't memorized it myself. But with the help of her grandfather, she memorized it, and she always for the rest of her life, she always had that poem in her head and recited it at some point for Jack Kennedy, who loved the poem and began to quote from it in his speeches, and later on Bobby and Ted. There's one moment in 1959 when John F. Kennedy was getting ready to run for president where he was up on, he hadn't announced yet, but he was up in a dais, I think it was in Washington State, and Jackie was there next to him, and he had a speech prepared, but he really didn't like the ending of the speech. So he wrote a note to Jackie, and in it, and you can see it at the top of this, the boxed part, give me the last lines to Ulysses, beginning with, "Come, my friends." Then after the words, "Come, my friends," in John F. Kennedy's handwriting, you see Jackie's handwriting, and she proceeded to write the rest of the poem for him from memory, and he then read it. And I'll read you the lines that she, not all of them, but most of the lines that she wrote out for him. So this is from Tennessee's Ulysses. "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die." And then it concludes with the lines, "Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Well, of course, John F. Kennedy died right outside our doors here in 1963, and Bobby Kennedy picked up the mantle, so to speak, and eventually ran for president. When he ran for president in 1968, published a collection of speeches and other writings from his campaign and gave it the title "To Seek a Newer World," which was also taken from that poem. He died in 1968, and Ted Kennedy eventually ran for president. Not for a few years. In his case, it wasn't until 1980 that he actively sought the presidency. He tried to take the Democratic nomination away from Jimmy Carter, the incumbent president. He failed in that effort, and at the 1980 Democratic Convention, gave one of the greatest speeches of his career, and I'm going to play a short segment of it for you here.
In the words of Tennyson that my brothers quoted and loved, and that have special meaning for me now, I am a part of all that I have met. Too much is taken, much abides. That which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. For me, a few hours ago, this campaign came to an end. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
Well, he failed in that effort, but he stayed in the Senate for decades to come. There's a story I tell of him when he was running for re-election in 1994 for the U.S. Senate. He was preparing for a debate against a guy named Mitt Romney, and he was down in the polls. His campaign was really in trouble, and he was going to have his first debate with Mitt Romney, which really was, of great benefit to Mitt Romney because he gets to share a stage with Kennedy. So he and Ted Kennedy, in advance of that day, as Kennedy was preparing for that debate, he went to the JFK library and visited the Victura, and just sat there and thought about his life and what it meant to be in politics. That poem I played for you earlier, or read for you earlier, Ulysses, is something that has just gone on and on. It continues to be memorized by some kids in the family. About 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, one of them, Connor Kennedy, memorized that poem in its entirety for a class. I think it was probably about 18. And Connor Kennedy is basically one of the grandkids of Robert Nethel, right? I think.
Correct.
Carrie's. No, not Carrie's. Anyway, one of the Kennedy kids. There's so many now. But Connor is much better known because he had a summer romance with Taylor Swift at some point after that. The other thing I wanted to also talk briefly about the role that sailing in the Victoria had for the Kennedy family, what it really meant to them. If I can get this to go forward. There we go. One of the things I really tried to get at in the book was the way in which sailing brought the family together, and how they obviously they campaigned for one another, but all throughout particularly during the 1930s and into the 1940s, the children of Joe and Rose spent days and days out on the sea racing together. And I really think that it had an extremely important role in the bond that brought them together, and then brought their children and their grandchildren, the nieces and the nephews, and the children who lost fathers, to bring them together. I had a great opportunity to interview a number of members of the family, and they're working and writing on this book. And one theme that I heard many times was, growing up, we sailed every day. And every day was an adventure because you never knew what would happen. Somebody would run the boat aground, or they'd, you never knew where the winds would take you, depending on the direction of the winds or how strong the winds would be. And so when I was invited to go for a sail with Chris Kennedy, who happens to live in the Chicago area, and I got to know him when I started working on the book, and I introduced myself to him, and he invited me out. And he took me out on a WNO Senior so that I could experience what that was like. It was the first time I ever had been on a WNO. And afterwards, it's a short sail, we come ashore, and he says, some members of my family are going to go out because, as I said earlier, Kennedys, they sail every day. So that day I happened to be there on a Tuesday morning, and a bunch of the family were going to go out. So Chris said, why don't you come along with us? So I did. And, I had spent, now that's me on the left there, I had spent, months trying to get Kennedys on the phone to interview them for the book, trying to schedule appointments for a phone interview or a personal interview. And it was a struggle, it would take quite a bit of time to get each individual. Now, all of a sudden, with no preparation at all, I have like 6 of them in front of me. And that's Ethel next to me there, and Ted Jr., and Max, who is a son of Robert and Ethel, and Chris Kennedy on the right, and Sheila Kennedy and Kiki Kennedy. Sheila married to Chris and Kiki to Ted. They're offering me, a glass of wine and some chicken, and I'm saying, no, I got to take notes. But at one point, when we first started sailing, Sheila, who I had an opportunity to meet earlier, wanting me to feel comfortable in the setting, knowing I was a little out of my element, said, hey, everybody, Jim here is writing a book. Tell everybody here about your book, Jim. And so all these Kennedy eyes turned toward me, and I'm thinking, boy, nobody's ever written about a book about the Kennedys before, so they're going to be really impressed by me. And I walked them through the premise, the role that sailing in the sea and the Victura had in bringing them together as a family, and how it has played a role all throughout the decades. And I mentioned the poem Ulysses and the imagery of the sea, told them the whole thing, and they all listened very politely. And Ted nodded, and they said, so who's going to buy this book anyway? So initial skepticism, yeah, but right after that, they started, showering me with stories, sailing with celebrities, Sammy Davis Jr., who got seasick when they took him out on one of the WNO Seniors. They talked about Ethel Kennedy. Ethel loved to sail and still loves to sail, although she's a little up in years now, so she's not necessarily going to get on a WNO Senior anymore, but she still goes out on the bigger boats. But she loved to just load the boat up with kids and go sailing in those years. And with Ethel and Chris there together, they both started telling me, I asked them about a story that I'd heard, so they started telling me, Ethel is somebody who, woman of strongly held beliefs. One of them is that powerboats always have the right, that reversed. Sailboats always have the right of way over powerboats. Absolutely, sailboats have the right of way over powerboats. Now that isn't, we know that isn't always true, but she held to that no matter how big the boat. This is a boat called the Uncatina, which is one of the big ferries that goes between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and Cape Cod. And there's one day in which I believe this boat was coming in toward Hyannis, the harbor there, and Ethel sailing gets right in front of the boat. One member of the crew told me that she actually purposely would sometimes get in front of the boat just to be a pest. And she, so the captain of that boat comes running out on the flying bridge there to yell at her to get out of the way and to complain about her habit of doing that. And she didn't. So the crew sees their captain out on the bridge, and that the captain isn't really paying attention to where the ferry's going. The ferry ran aground, and they broke a propeller, and Ethel just sailed on. And apparently they changed the local maritime rules to make it a little bit more clear when powerboats actually have the right of way over sailboats. How much time do we have? Okay. Well, I think I'll finish with this story. The gentleman on the right is a guy named Henry Kohler, who is in his 80s now, but in 1963, when John F. Kennedy is the president, Bobby Kennedy is the U.S. Attorney General, Ted is the is the member of the United States Senate. And three sisters got together in anticipation of Christmas 1963. They decided what these three guys really want for Christmas is a painting of the Victura, one for each of them, 3 paintings. And I forget what I was going to say. Anyway, so they commission Henry Kohler, the guy on the right, to make these 3 paintings. And he goes to work on them. He has a studio in New York. At some point, one of the sisters decides, oh, by the way, Henry really did his homework. He went down to Hyannis Port. He went out on one of the power yachts with Joe Sr., who at that time was an invalid in a wheelchair because he had suffered a stroke, but the family liked to bring him out on the water just to get some air. So Henry's out there making sketches of Hyannis seniors that sailed around the waters out there. And he brought all of that prep work back to his studio in New York, and he's working on that painting in the fall of '63. And a sister decides she wants to come over and check on the progress he's making with the paintings. And in anticipation of the sister coming, he usually likes to paint with music on the radio, but he turned the radio off, and the sister came over and just loved the work that he was doing. Very complimentary. Keep going at it. Don't change a thing. Continue making the paintings. And he continued working on it. She left the studio and walked down the street, and the phone rang. And it was Henry's fiance at the time. Do you have the radio on, Henry? No. The president's just been shot. So he ran out the door to look for the sister. He couldn't remember which sister it was to this day. He can't remember which one it was. But he just said it wasn't Eunice. But so he went looking for her. He couldn't. She had gone around the corner. He found out later that the sister had learned about the assassination from a stranger who recognized her walking down the street. But he thought his work would be done, that they wouldn't want these paintings, and so he sort of stalled the work. But then he got a call asking, how's the progress coming on these paintings? So he said, I painted with both hands to get them done in time for Christmas, and he presented them to the family and never saw them again until about 4 or 5 years ago, when this particular painting was discovered by his stepson at auction, and his stepson was able to acquire it for him. I'll give you a quick look at some of these pictures. This is Ted. The other one was of John F. Kennedy, the yellow one. This is of Ted and Joan. And this one is of Robert Kennedy and Ethel. Last summer, I visited Chris Kennedy at Cape Cod again, and we went for another sail last summer. And he said, let's go visit my mother, Ethel, and she still lives in that house next to the famous one that Joe and Rose raised the kids in. And I was there in the living room, and I looked in the dining room, and there was this painting 50 years after they got it. And these are not masterpieces by any means, but you can imagine the emotional attachment that they had to that painting and to that sailboat. And to me, if there's any indication of the meaning of sailing and the Victura to the family, the story of these paintings it's got to be some indication of it. And the Kennedys have accomplished so much when you think about their lives. The 9 children of Joe and Rose who grew up sailing together, one became president, one the U.S. Attorney General, one a U.S. Senator. Jean became the U.S. Ambassador to Ireland. Patricia married the actor Peter Lawford and was instrumental as a campaign supporter throughout the early years. Eunice Kennedy helped the world redefine our acceptance of people with disabilities through her work with Special Olympics and other things. Joe Jr. died a hero's death in World War II when he was piloting an experimental aircraft. Kathleen Kennedy, the sister, married an heir to a duke and died in an airplane crash in the late 1940s. Rosemary was born with an intellectual disability, but it was the experience of living with her that introduced Eunice to the needs, the special needs of people with intellectual disabilities, and gave her that passion for helping people like that. So when you consider what this family became and all that how they grew up together, I believe that this experience of sailing together really had a contribution to creating that glue that bound them together and helped them march forward throughout their individual accomplishments, and to this day, because they're still in politics and Remaited is much more famous for their commitment to public service today than to sailing. And a much more important thing that binds them together, of course. But I hope that this story gives you a sense of what it meant to grow up a Kennedy and to be a member of the family. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions that you have.
Jim, you mentioned liking to look at other boats when you're on the water. They look much better when they're behind you.
That's right. That's exactly right. Joe Kennedy, one of the sons of Robert Nethel, told of racing against Teddy, and Teddy was always ahead. He was a very good racer. But one day he was racing and he's passing Ted sailing the Victura, and he said, "My God, I'm passing Ted. I can't believe it." And he pulls up and he looks down and over at Ted, and Ted was waist deep in water. The Victura was sinking. And it split a seam, and it was after that they donated the boat to the museum, where it they never sail it anymore. Yep.
What exactly inspired you to write this particular book?
I first saw the Victoria at the museum, I guess it would have been the early 1990s, when I was just visiting as a tourist in Boston. And I always loved the boat. I always thought I loved it. That was just the kind of boat I would love to have myself. And now I do have one, not dissimilar from the Victoria. But so I always had that image of that wonderful artifact of a U.S. president in my mind. But when I heard, and I love to write, I love history and I love writing. I've always wanted to take on the challenge of writing an interesting history, and I love histories that are written from an interesting or unique perspective. And when I saw, knowing that the Victoria had been the John F. Kennedy sailboat, and then I saw this funeral that I described earlier, and these four people who all felt that this was such an important part of their lives, that told me that maybe it's building a narrative around that boat and carrying it through the decades. Maybe that'll give us some insight into the family, and it certainly did for me, and I hope it does for anybody who reads the book. Anybody else?
Yes. Why do you think we still care about the Kennedys? Your book is selling. I bought a copy. I still care. I'm going to read it. But why do you think so much time has passed now, and Ted Kennedy is gone, really the last? And why do we?
Isn't it such an epic story? I mean, it's like a Greek tragedy itself. All the triumphs and the tragedies that they've been through. Some self-inflicted. Some like the one here, inflicted by outside forces. But so I think the drama of the story itself is something that captures the imagination. And John F. Kennedy was such he was an amazing speaker. I had an opportunity to do some political speech writing in my career, and I certainly drew from his speeches as a model for what made a good speech. And who hasn't drawn from the model of the Kennedys in all kinds of other ways, leading up to Obamacare, for example, which had so much of its roots in Ted Kennedy's career. So I think there's both substance and art and literature and the drama and the intrigue of the story that keeps that myth alive.
I was a pretty impressionable age when he was killed, and I saw him when he was running for president. And I mean, there was just this energy, this youthfulness, and these cute little kids, and all of this. And there's something very poignant about sitting in this building and knowing 50 yards as the crow flies. Have you been down downstairs. Have you had a chance to tour the museum?
I did today for the first time, and it's a wonderful museum. If anybody here hasn't seen it, I really encourage you to. It's a great balanced picture of the Kennedy legacy, the family, some of the family portrayed there. So it's not all about the assassination, but of course this is the place to have that story told, and they do it really, really extraordinarily well.
And you look at when Jacqueline Kennedy was 34, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that woman was able to, take this country forward through those, through those weeks, and at the tender age of 34, which is really an amazing amount of courage and poise.
Yeah, I tell the story in the book about when he died, and they put Kennedy's casket in the East Room for a period of time before they had all the funeral and the ceremonies. Jackie and Bobby went up to the casket and placed in it scrimshaw, the carved whalebone that the sailors used to carve images of ships. And I think some of Bobby took off a tie clasp that was an image of the PT-109 that the boat he sailed or was skippered in World War II. So even at a time like that, it all comes back to sailing in a lot of ways.
Do you think that this group would like to hear about the doodles?
Yeah, well, throughout the White House years, President Kennedy would be sitting in meetings, and he would draw doodles of all kinds of things, sometimes geometric patterns, but the most common subject was a little sailboat. And so there's several drawings he made in meetings of sails with a gaff rig, just like the Victura. And on the evening of November 21st, or maybe early evening of November 21st, 1963, he was staying at the Rice Hotel in Houston. He didn't spend the night there, but he took a room there with Jackie for several hours before he went off for the evening's events. And I don't know what he was doing. He was working on a speech. He was taking phone calls, but he made a little doodle of a sailboat and left it in the room, and then went on and spent the night in another hotel before. That was his last night on Earth, and there was this little picture of a sailboat. So it's poignant to think about that being in his thoughts, in the final hours of his life.
I'd like to ask a question about the name of the boat. They said it was in the video. It said it was a gift for his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Was it already named? Did he name it?
John F. Kennedy named it, and I had the opportunity to research the book at the JFK Library, and it was fun to go through all the old letters. But one of my fondest discoveries was a letter that Joe had written to, I think it was an assistant to, Joe Jr. had written a letter to an assistant to Joe Sr., his dad, saying, we're this boat that we're having built for us, we want it to be painted white. It was originally white and then painted blue later. And the trim, the bottom paint should be this color, and a few other details. But we don't know the name of the boat yet because Jack is in the infirmary right now and we can't talk to him. But we'll get back to you on that. And then I found the letter later communicating to the boat builder. The name of the boat is Victura. And Victura is a Latin word. And so Jack picked the name, and it's a Latin word that means about to conquer. And I actually first came across that story, an interview he did in 1960 during the presidential campaign, and a reporter asked him why Victoria, why did he name it? And he said, about to conquer. So he's a politician about to, face an election, and he says about to conquer. And I thought, that has to be a made up story. But I checked with a scholar of the Latin language at Dartmouth, and in fact, he's absolutely right on the translation. In the back?
Kind of dwell on how historical perspective evolves. And I wonder if in your research you felt like the context of the Kennedys and, with regard to the tragedy that happened to JFK a long time ago, how that kind of echoed through, if that was evolving now to maybe a more, peaceful look on the family and the accomplishments. So we're not just so attached looking
Yeah.
at the cover of your book and the picture of the sailboats, it feels like a very peaceful and familial.
Yeah. So you're talking about the way that historians write about the Kennedys and over a period of time. Yeah. Yeah, I chose to write a book that I thought would be, there's so many books about various scandals and criticisms of the Kennedys, and they have their place. There's no question, and some of those observations are well-founded. But I wanted to tell a story that was a bit more positive and something that you could take away to, something maybe you learn a lesson about what makes a family strong and how shared experiences that a family purposely creates together to strengthen the family, how that might benefit you. And I'm hoping that you read the book and you think, my family, maybe we should have a Victura in our family, maybe not a sailboat, but something else. But it's important to have those other stories told, and I don't mind that at all. But I thought it was time for a story, a more positive portrait to be told, because of you go through periods of time after the president died, they're all, the glowing portraits flowed out, and then the brothers ran, and the negative stories began to come out. Some of them politically motivated, some of them, there's more to it than that. But my feeling was maybe the pendulum is swinging another way, and it's time to take a fresh look at some of those things that we found inspiring back then, and that we might still find inspiring today.
I think you bring up such a provocative fact, and I want to tie this to Lucy being a graduate of Hockaday, and such a strong woman yourself. And I see the influence that now I had no idea about the poem. And you can just, I am imagining being Jacqueline and thinking, who would have thought it that when I was 10 years old, and the path is chosen for me right already, that I memorized this poem, and now I'm in love with this man, and it's something I can bring to him, and how impactful it was, not just even that moment, but continuing through the family and the boys, that this dear, fragile, yet very strong, independent woman should make such a contribution to a family, and here you are telling us the story. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. I did not know that much about Jackie Kennedy going into the writing of this book, but the more I researched it and understood her contribution, the more I appreciated it. And it's kind of a complicated. She's a complicated person because she was somewhat traditional, I guess, for that era. But very obviously very, very smart and very well read. And she actively was involved in speech making. She would be the one who would find the great quote from classic literature that would work in a particular speech. And after Jack died, she did the same for Bobby, and probably for Ted as well. But I know something like when Bobby gave a speech at the Democratic Convention, I guess it was '64, and he quoted Shakespeare. I forget it was something about all the stars and the garish sun, whatever that, if you remember that quote. But that came from Jackie, so she, really had an enormous influence for many, many years to come. And Caroline, has published a collection of poems that her mother loved. So I was enormously impressed by Jacqueline Kennedy.
Here's one quick. After all of his back injuries, were there any accommodations he needed in order to sail?
Not that I know of for sailing. I mean, I think he probably wouldn't go sailing if his back was acting up. And he had some major surgery in the 50s that almost, I think it almost killed him. I mean, it really didn't go very well. And, Bobby used to say the guy had pain all throughout his life. So I think I think historians have said that he ended up having to take a fair share of painkillers to get through it. But I think it was, my understanding is that the conditions would come and go depending, as many people with back pain probably have that experience. So he somehow managed to hide it. He was a tough guy for sure.
Sailing's pretty physical.
Yeah.
activity.
Yeah, you know, the White House years, I told a story about him sailing and running aground, but more often he would be on a bigger yacht and watching Ted race, from what I've read or what I learned in the book. So he didn't seem to get on those small boats that often, and maybe for that reason. I should probably, just in case people have an evening to to continue with beyond this, I should probably wrap it up. Thanks everybody for coming out.